I was in the middle of the most important presentation of my career when the message flashed across my phone. Account access revoked. Employment terminated, effective immediately. My heart didn't skip a beat. I'd been expecting this. What the 14 directors of Nordwell Industries sitting around that mahogany table didn't know was that I, the person who'd just been fired, was the only one who could deliver the $88 million deal they were waiting for. And when my boss, hovering near the door, mouthed, "Wrap it up," with an impatient flick of his wrist, I did exactly that, but not in the way he thought. They lost everything. And me, I'd been ready for this moment all along. My name is Eliza Monroe. I'm 38 years old, and until approximately 12 minutes ago, I was the Senior Director of Client Strategy at Cavalier Group, a digital business solutions firm headquartered in Austin, Texas. I say was, because according to the notification that just lit up my phone, visible only to me while I stood confidently explaining our implementation timeline to a room full of potential clients, I no longer worked there. The irony wasn't lost on me. 7 months of preparation, countless late nights, hundreds of research hours, and dozens of preliminary meetings had led to this moment. I was about to close the largest deal Cavalier had seen all year, an $88 million contract with Nordwell Industries, a global manufacturing conglomerate that would put our company on an entirely new playing field. And more importantly for me, it would have secured my position, my promised partnership, and the future I'd been working toward for the past 6 years. Would have. I smiled at the Nordwell executive who'd just asked about our implementation timeline and continued my explanation without missing a beat. I had exactly 14 minutes left in my presentation, and I intended to use every second of them, just not for Cavalier's benefit anymore. This betrayal hadn't come without warning. The signs had been building for weeks, ever since Victor Lang took over as CEO 3 months ago. Victor was what I'd call a credit thief, someone who swoops in at the last minute, attaches himself to successful projects, and somehow ends up with his name in the spotlight while the people who did the actual work fade into the background. 2 weeks after he started, I noticed Victor beginning to insert himself into the Nordwell deal. At first, it seemed innocent enough, wanting to be briefed on our progress, suggesting minor adjustments to the proposal. Then came the strategic oversight meetings that somehow never included me despite my role as lead on the account. The final red flag was watching him present my slides I had created, with data I had analyzed, to our board, referring to them as work from my team. I didn't confront him. I'd been in business long enough to know that direct confrontation rarely works with men like Victor. Instead, I started preparing. The first sign of trouble had come when I discovered my access to certain shared folders had been quietly restricted. Then my name disappeared from email chains I'd initiated. The final confirmation was when Melissa from HR scheduled a mysterious position evaluation meeting for next week. They weren't even trying to be subtle. So I did what any strategic thinker would do. I created a contingency plan. Every document I'd developed for the Nordwell pitch, the strategic framework, the implementation timeline, the ROI models, the risk analyses, all existed in duplicate. One set lived on Cavalier's servers, the other on my personal encrypted drive, not company property, but my intellectual work, created on my own time, using my own proprietary methods developed before I joined Cavalier. I'd been careful about that from the start. While Victor was busy playing corporate politics, I was establishing Nova Bridge Solutions. At first, it was just a folder on my hard drive, a collection of business plans, strategies, and templates. Then it became a registered LLC. Then it acquired a small office space and a professional website, all within 3 weeks, while I continued to perform my duties at Cavalier flawlessly, giving them no cause for complaint. 2 former colleagues who'd left Cavalier the previous year joined me as founding partners: James Fletcher, our technical genius, and Diane Rodriguez, our operations wizard. They'd both departed after similar experiences with Cavalier's previous leadership. We'd stayed in touch, and when I sent them the business plan for Nova Bridge, they didn't hesitate. We had a code phrase, Orion Online, that would signal when it was time to activate our launch sequence. Which brings me back to that boardroom at Nordwell Industries, where I was calmly explaining implementation timelines while mentally calculating my next moves. I had just reached the section on risk mitigation when the notification came through. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more vindictive. Someone at Cavalier had deliberately waited until I was in the middle of the most critical presentation to pull the trigger. I looked up from my slides and saw Victor standing at the back of the room, arms crossed, a thin smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He'd shown up to support, despite not being scheduled to attend. Now I understood why. He mouthed, "Wrap it up," with a dismissive hand gesture. He thought he had me cornered. As I was saying, I continued smoothly, our risk mitigation strategy accounts for potential supply chain disruptions through a 3-tiered contingency model. I advanced to the next slide, one that I'd modified just slightly from the version on Cavalier's server. This version had no Cavalier branding in the footer, just a subtle watermark that would only be visible if someone looked for it. This approach ensures business continuity even in worst-case scenarios. I finished the presentation exactly as planned, answered every question with precision and authority, and thanked the Nordwell team for their time. Not once did I let on that anything was amiss. Not once did I mention that I'd just been fired. I simply collected my materials, shook hands with the decision-makers, and walked out of the room with my head high. Victor was waiting in the hallway, flanked by 2 security personnel. "I'll need your company phone and laptop," he said, not bothering with pretense. I handed over the devices without comment. They'd been wiped and reset to factory settings an hour before the meeting. "Your personal belongings from the office will be shipped to you," he added, clearly disappointed by my lack of reaction. "HR will be in touch about exit procedures." "Thank you," I said simply, and walked away. In the elevator down to the lobby, I sent a text from my personal phone, Orion Online. James and Diane responded within seconds with thumbs-up emojis. Nova Bridge was officially launching. Earlier than planned, but fully prepared. I'd spent the past 3 weeks working through the nights to ensure everything was ready for this possibility. The most satisfying email arrived exactly 43 minutes after I left the building. It was from Thomas Weatherby, Nordwell's Chief Strategy Officer. "Eliza, excellent presentation today. The team was impressed with your thorough understanding of our needs and challenges. We'd like to move forward with the proposal as discussed. With you as our primary point of contact, please send over the final contract documentation at your earliest convenience." I knew what would happen next. Cavalier would respond, explaining that I was no longer with the company and attempting to substitute Victor or someone else as the point of contact, and I knew exactly how Nordwell would react. Thomas Weatherby was old school and valued relationships above all. We'd spent months building trust. He wouldn't take kindly to a last-minute personnel switch on an $88 million deal. I waited 24 hours before sending my response. "Thomas, thank you for your positive feedback. I wanted to let you know that I am no longer with Cavalier Group as of yesterday. I've recently founded Nova Bridge Solutions, where we specialize in the exact type of strategic implementation we discussed. I completely understand if you wish to continue with Cavalier, but should you want to discuss alternatives, I'm available at your convenience." Professional, factual, non-disparaging toward my former employer, and devastating in its implications. The response came within the hour. Nordwell was suspending all negotiations with Cavalier and requested a meeting with me at Nova Bridge the following morning. I later heard from Talia, my former assistant who was still at Cavalier, that the office erupted into chaos when Nordwell's email arrived informing them they were pulling out of the deal. Victor had apparently thrown a stapler across the conference room. The HR director was frantically reviewing my employment contract, looking for non-compete clauses they could enforce. They wouldn't find any. I'd helped draft our employment agreements years ago and had carefully negotiated my own terms when I joined. I knew exactly what I could and couldn't do. The meeting with Nordwell the next day exceeded all expectations. We met in Nova Bridge's modest but professional office space secured with a 6-month lease and furnished in record time. James and Diane were there, along with our newly hired legal counsel. I presented a revised proposal that offered all the benefits of the original Cavalier deal. plus additional customizations that I knew Nordwell wanted but Victor had refused to include because they'd require more work. The difference, I explained to Thomas and his team, is that at Nova Bridge, you'll be working directly with the leadership team at every stage. The people creating your strategy are the same people implementing it. No handoffs, no miscommunications. 3 days later, Nova Bridge Solutions signed an $88 million contract with Nordwell Industries, our first client, and one that immediately established us as a serious player in the industry. But it didn't stop there. Within 2 weeks, 2 other potential clients I'd been nurturing at Cavalor reached out. They'd heard I'd moved on and wanted to know if my new venture could accommodate their needs. Of course, we could, and we did. In the space of 45 days, Cavalor lost 3 major deals to Nova Bridge. Their stock took a hit when the quarterly results came in well below projections. The board started asking uncomfortable questions about Victor's leadership. Meanwhile, Nova Bridge was growing faster than even I had anticipated. We hired selectively, focusing on quality over quantity. Talia, who'd been assigned to learn the ropes so she could replace me on other accounts, reached out asking for advice. I offered her a job instead. She joined us 2 weeks later, bringing with her intimate knowledge of Cavalor's increasingly desperate attempts to stop the bleeding. 6 months after my abrupt dismissal, Nova Bridge and Cavalor found themselves competing for the same international client, a European manufacturing consortium looking for digital transformation services. The difference was that now we were competing on equal footing, both invited to bid based on industry reputation. We won, not because of any inside information or personal connections, but because our approach was simply better. We understood the client's needs more thoroughly and proposed solutions that addressed their specific challenges rather than trying to force-fit a standardized package. The aftermath at Cavalor was swift. Victor was laterally moved to a position with an impressive title, but no real authority. The HR director resigned. The company announced a restructuring that everyone in the industry recognized as damage control. 1 year after that fateful presentation, I stood in the lobby of Nova Bridge's new headquarters, a full floor in one of Austin's premier office buildings, looking at our company logo emblazoned on the wall. Around me were 19 former Cavalor employees who joined us over the past year, each bringing valuable skills and a shared desire to work somewhere their contributions would be recognized and rewarded. I never filed a lawsuit against Cavalor. I never publicly criticized Victor or the company. I didn't need to. Success was my revenge, delivered not with malice but with meticulous professionalism. When they tried to silence my voice, I built my own room to speak in one where I could be heard more clearly than ever before. I've learned many lessons throughout my career, but perhaps the most valuable came from that moment when I stood in Nordwell's boardroom, seeing the termination notice while continuing my presentation without missing a beat. It taught me that preparation isn't paranoid, it's professional. That recognizing the signs of betrayal isn't cynical, it's perceptive, and that the best response to underestimation isn't outrage, it's excellence. The $88 million deal that Victor thought he could steal became the foundation of something far more valuable, a company built on integrity, where credit goes to those who earn it, and where the work speaks for itself. As for Victor, I heard he finally got what he wanted. His name is now synonymous with Cavalor Group. Unfortunately for him, that's no longer something to boast about in industry circles. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make isn't saying anything at all, it's simply succeeding where others expected you to fail. And when someone tells you to wrap it up, sometimes the best response is to do exactly that, just on your own terms. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me as I sat in my new office, reviewing the quarterly results for Nova Bridge's first year in operation. We had exceeded projections by 42%, signed 15 major clients, and built a team of 37 brilliant professionals who shared our vision. The $88 million Nordwell deal had been just the beginning. The path to this point hadn't been without challenges. In those first few weeks after leaving Cavalor, there were moments of doubt, nights spent questioning whether I'd made the right decision, whether I'd overestimated my own value in the equation. Starting a company from scratch requires more than just expertise in your field. It demands a whole new skill set, an ability to wear multiple hats, to make decisions without the safety net of corporate infrastructure. But with each challenge came confirmation that we were on the right track. When our first invoice to Nordwell was paid on time and in full, I framed the transaction receipt and hung it on the wall of our modest first office. When we hired our 5th employee, we celebrated with champagne and plastic cups. When we outgrew that initial office space after just 4 months, the moving day felt like a graduation. I learned that building something new offers a freedom that fighting the old never could. We weren't bound by legacy systems or outdated thinking. We could design our company culture intentionally, create processes that actually served our purposes rather than existing because that's how it's always been done. The contrast with Cavalor became more apparent with each passing month, where they had layers of approval that slowed decision-making to a crawl. We moved with agility, where they hoarded information in silos. We embraced transparency, where they pitted employees against each other in competition for recognition. We celebrated collective achievements. This wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. Our clients noticed the difference. In an industry where missed deadlines and scope creep were considered inevitable, we were delivering projects on time and on budget. Where communication breakdowns were accepted as a necessary evil of complex implementations, we maintained clear lines of accountability from start to finish. You know what impressed me most? Thomas from Nordwell told me over dinner. 6 months into our partnership, it wasn't just that you delivered what you promised, though you did. And that's rare enough. It was that everyone on your team could explain not just what they were doing, but why they were doing it. They understood the big picture. That was intentional. At Nova Bridge, everyone had access to the strategic framework for every project. Technical specialists understood the business objectives. Account managers understood the technical constraints. No one was just executing tasks in isolation. The Nordwell implementation became our calling card, a case study in how digital transformation should be done. When it came in 3 weeks ahead of schedule and demonstrated ROI within the first quarter, word spread throughout the industry. We didn't need to spend on marketing, our clients did it for us. Of course, Cavalor didn't go down without a fight. There were attempts to discredit us, whisper campaigns suggesting we'd stolen proprietary methodology, even a cease and desist letter claiming intellectual property infringement that their lawyers quickly withdrew when our legal team responded with detailed documentation of my independent development work. The most absurd moment came when Victor himself reached out, suggesting a strategic partnership between our companies. The email arrived exactly 10 months after he'd had me escorted from the building. I think we both recognize there's more to be gained through collaboration than competition, he wrote, as if our history could be so easily erased. Cavalor's established market presence combined with Nova Bridge's innovative approach could be powerful. I read between the lines. Cavalor was floundering. Their client acquisition costs were rising as their reputation faltered. They needed what we had built, and Victor, ever the opportunist, was looking for a lifeboat. My response was polite but firm. Thank you for the interest in Nova Bridge. We're currently focused on our existing growth trajectory and not exploring partnership opportunities at this time. No vitriol, no reminders of past betrayals, just a clear boundary and the unspoken message, you have nothing I need. Turning down that overture felt like closing a chapter. I realized I no longer thought about Cavalor daily, no longer measured our success against what I'd left behind. Nova Bridge had become its own entity with its own momentum, defined not by what it stood against, but by what it stood for. That shift in perspective coincided with another significant milestone: our decision to open a second office. Market analysis and client feedback pointed clearly to Chicago as our next location. The expansion would allow us to better serve our Midwest clients and tap into a rich talent pool. The Chicago launch brought a new set of challenges and opportunities. I found myself traveling frequently, dividing time between locations, trusting my team to maintain momentum in Austin while I established our presence in a new market. It was a test of the systems we'd built, the culture we'd established, and the leadership team we'd assembled. It was also a personal test. for so long. My identity had been wrapped up in being the indispensable expert, the person who needed to touch every decision. Now I was intentionally removing myself from day-to-day operations in our flagship office, forcing myself to delegate not just tasks, but authority. James and Diane stepped up beautifully, each growing into expanded roles. We hired a Chicago office director with deep local connections and industry expertise. The transition wasn't perfectly smooth. There were communication hiccups, occasional misalignments, moments when I had to resist the urge to step in and fix situations remotely. But with each challenge addressed, our organization grew stronger, more resilient. 18 months after that fateful presentation at Nordwell, Nova Bridge had grown to 53 employees across 2 locations, with a client portfolio that spanned industries and a reputation for excellence that drew both customers and talent to our door. We'd moved beyond being the company Eliza Monroe started after leaving Cavalier to simply being Nova Bridge, recognized on our own merits. It was during this period of growth and transition that I received an unexpected message. It came not from Victor or anyone in Cavalier's current leadership, but from Jeffrey Hammond, the founder of Cavalier, who had stepped back from day-to-day operations 3 years earlier and maintained only a board position. "I've been watching what you've built with interest," his message read. "Would welcome the opportunity to buy you coffee next time you're in Austin." I was curious enough to accept. We met at a quiet cafe away from the business district. Jeffrey looked older than I remembered, the pressures of the past year evident in the new lines around his eyes. "I owe you an apology," he said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. I knew what Victor was like when I supported his appointment. I thought his aggressiveness was what the company needed in a changing market. I didn't anticipate how that same quality would manifest internally. I appreciated his candor but remained guarded. "That's business," I said. "We all make hiring decisions we later regret." "This was more than a hiring mistake," he countered. "It was a failure of vision. I built Cavalier to be a place where the best minds in the industry could do their best work. Somewhere along the way, that mission got lost. Watching what you've created with Nova Bridge, it reminds me of what Cavalier was meant to be." There was a wistfulness in his tone that resonated with me, despite everything. I still remembered why I'd joined Cavalier in the first place, the promise it had once held. "The board is making changes," Jeffrey continued. "Victor is out, effective next month. We're reassessing everything's structure, culture, strategic direction. I'd value your perspective, not as a potential employee that ship has sailed. I understand, but as someone who knew the company at its best and has built something exceptional in contrast." I considered his request carefully. There was no practical benefit to Nova Bridge in helping Cavalier rediscover its soul. If anything, a floundering competitor served our business interests. But this wasn't about business strategy, it was about something more fundamental. "I'll think about it," I told him honestly. And I did. For 2 weeks, I wrestled with the question of whether to engage or maintain my distance. I discussed it with James and Diane, whose perspectives differed, but who both supported whatever decision I made. In the end, I agreed to a single consulting session with Cavalier's board, not to help them compete with Nova Bridge, but to help them rediscover what had once made them valuable in their own right. The session was challenging but productive. I spoke frankly about the cultural issues I'd observed, the structural problems that had allowed someone like Victor to dismantle in months what had taken years to build. I didn't focus on my personal experience, but on the systemic failures it represented. And I offered concrete suggestions for rebuilding, not to recreate what had been lost, but to construct something new that honored the original vision while adapting to current realities. When I left the Cavalier offices that day, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. The company that had betrayed me was not the same company I had once believed in. Both existed under the same name, but they were separate entities in my mind now. And by contributing to the potential rebirth of the values I'd once shared, I was honoring my own journey rather than enabling a competitor. Jeffrey sent a handwritten note afterward, thanking me for my insights and candor. "What you've built at Nova Bridge is remarkable," he wrote, "but perhaps your greatest legacy may be helping 2 companies find their true north." I wasn't sure about that. Nova Bridge was still my primary focus, my passion, my future. But there was something satisfying in releasing the last tendrils of resentment, in recognizing that success isn't zero-sum, that the business landscape is large enough for multiple companies doing good work in their own ways. 2 years after that boardroom dismissal, Nova Bridge had become a recognized industry leader. We'd grown to over 100 employees across 3 offices. We were winning awards, being featured in business publications, receiving acquisition offers that we politely declined. The $88 million Nordwell deal that had once seemed so momentous was now just one of many success stories in our portfolio. And Cavalor. They had indeed undergone a transformation, with new leadership and a renewed focus on their core strengths. They'd stabilized and begun to regain ground. They were no longer our primary competitor. We'd moved into different market segments, targeting different client profiles. We occasionally crossed paths in the industry, but the encounters were professional, even cordial. In a strange way, being fired turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me, not because it led to financial success or professional recognition, though both came in abundance, but because it forced me to articulate what I truly valued, to build something that aligned with those values from the ground up, rather than trying to carve out space for them within someone else's structure. I think about that moment in the Nordwell boardroom, often standing there with the termination notice lighting up my phone, continuing my presentation without missing a beat. It wasn't just professionalism that carried me through. It was the absolute certainty that while Cavalor could take away my job, they couldn't take away my expertise, my relationships, or my vision. They thought they were ending something. In reality, they were setting it free. On the 3rd anniversary of Nova Bridge's founding, we held a company celebration at our Austin headquarters. Looking around the room at the team, we'd assembled some who'd been with us from the beginning. Others who'd joined along the way, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. These weren't just employees. They were co-creators of something meaningful. I raised my glass for a toast, keeping it brief as I always do at these events. 3 years ago, a door closed, I said. And because it did, we had to build our own house. Here's to the architects, the builders, and the dreamers who made it a home. As conversations and laughter flowed around me afterward, I stepped out onto the balcony for a moment of quiet reflection. The Austin skyline spread before me, lights twinkling in the dusk. Somewhere among those buildings was the Cavalor office where I'd once thought my future lay. And here I stood, in a place I couldn't have imagined then, on a path that had revealed itself only after the one I'd planned was cut off. Thomas Weatherby from Nordwell joined me on the balcony, now not just a client but a friend after years of successful partnership. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, handing me a fresh drink. I smiled, just reflecting on unexpected journeys. "Well, I'll drink to that," he replied. "Though I have to say, from where I stand, there's nothing unexpected about your success. The signs were always there for those paying attention." "Including when I was being fired in the middle of presenting to you?" I asked with a raised eyebrow. He laughed. "Especially then. The way you handled that moment told me everything I needed to know about who you are. Most people would have fallen apart or lashed out. You just continued delivering excellence. That's rare." His words touched on something I'd come to understand only recently, that defining moments rarely announce themselves as such. They're usually disguised as ordinary challenges, inconveniences, or even disasters. It's our response, not the moment itself, that determines their significance. "You know," Thomas continued, "we've never really talked about this, but I knew something was off that day. Victor's behavior, the tension in the room. I couldn't put my finger on it until I saw him try to rush you through the risk assessment portion, the exact section where Cavalor's proposal was weakest compared to other vendors we'd seen. I hadn't known that. And yet you still asked all those detailed questions." "Of course," he said with a slight smile. "I wanted to see how you'd handle it, whether you'd dodge or deliver. When you provided answers that were more thorough than the written materials we'd received, I suspected you were the real architect of the proposal. When you continued seamlessly despite whatever was happening with your phone, I was certain of it." This revelation shifted my understanding of that pivotal day. What I'd experienced as betrayal had simultaneously been an opportunity to demonstrate my true value not through claims or credentials, but through performance under pressure. "Well," I said, raising my glass, "here's to asking the right questions at the right time." "And to answering them with integrity," Thomas replied. We rejoined the celebration inside, where James was regaling a group of new hires with the story of our first office, how we'd furnished it entirely with second-hand furniture found on Craigslist, how the air conditioning had failed during a heat wave in our second week, how we'd pitched to a Fortune 500 client with makeshift visual aids after our projector died mid-presentation. Those early war stories had already taken on a mythic quality, the hardships transformed into badges of honor by subsequent success. But listening to James tell them, I was struck by how present those memories still felt, the blend of terror and exhilaration that had characterized those first months, the sense that we were building something meaningful from nothing but belief and determination. Later that night, after the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, I sat alone in my office looking at a frame on my wall. It contained my termination notice from Cavalor, printed and preserved alongside a simple handwritten note, "Best thing that ever happened to me." It wasn't meant as a slight against my former employer, but as a reminder to myself that setbacks can be redirections, that closed doors sometimes force us to build our own entrances, that what seems like an ending can be the necessary catalyst for a more authentic beginning. The next morning, I arrived at the office early as usual. The cleaning crew had already erased most evidence of the previous night's celebration, restoring our workspace to its normal productive state. I walked through the quiet halls, taking a moment to appreciate what we'd built before the energy and chaos of another workday began. My assistant, Maya, arrived just as I was making coffee in the break room. She'd joined Nova Bridge 18 months earlier, coming from a competitor with a reputation for grinding through staff. Her talent had been evident immediately, but what struck me most was watching her gradually shed the defensive habits she'd developed in a toxic environment, the constant seeking of approval, the expectation of criticism, the reluctance to offer ideas. "Good morning," she said, setting down a stack of folders. The Chicago team sent over the final revisions for the Kimura proposal. They addressed all the points from yesterday's call. "Excellent," I replied. "Any word from the Singapore prospects?" "They've confirmed for next week's video conference, 9 p.m. our time." She hesitated, then added, "Also, there's something else you should know. Raytech reached out yesterday afternoon." My interest was immediately piqued. Raytech was one of Cavalor's largest remaining clients, a technology